In troubling times such as these, those who inhabit the great house look to the past for answers and solutions to the problems of the present. Unfortunately, whether it is the past, the present, or the future, it was then as it is now and as it will ever be. For all that can be found is tragedy and terror at Collinwood. Be careful, my friend, where you tread, for I warn you now, there are spoilers ahead. Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. I am your hostess, Penny Dreadful, aka Danielle, and I am here with Dr. Andrew Higgins. I am really excited to have him here. Finally, it's taken a while for me to schedule this, and I do apologize, but Dr. Andrew Higgins is a Tolkien scholar who received his PhD through Cardiff Metropolitan University on the genesis of Tolkien's mythology and co-edited with Dr. Dimitra Fimi the book A Secret Vice, Tolkien on Language Invention, published by HarperCollins in February 2020. After 11 years as Director of Development at the Glyndebourne Opera, he started a new adventure as Director of Development at Imperial War Museums. Andrew is a trustee of British Youth Opera, the UK Tolkien Society, and Signum University. He also wrote a scholarly essay entitled The Gothic World Building of Dark Shadows, which was featured in the 2020 publication Exploring Imaginary Worlds, Essays on Media, Structure, and Subcreation. Andrew, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Penny. Oh, it is amazing to be here. And as I said to you before we started taping, I am so excited and grateful for what you're doing with the Dark Shadows community and this podcast, because I love Dark Shadows. I love geeking out on Dark Shadows. And so to have fellow Dark Shadows people all around the world doing it is amazing. So thank you for everything you're doing.
Oh my goodness, gosh, it's my pleasure, and I appreciate you. You know, you were one of the first listeners who actually reached out to me when I launched the podcast with some really nice emails, and you sent me some. You actually hipped me to something I was unaware of, which was Seabury Quinn's "The Door Without a Key" being the inspiration for the I-Ching usage in Dark Shadows. And I read the story you sent it to me from Weird Tales, and wow, you are 100% on the money with that, because that really is the story.
I have to thank an amazing guy who's a fantastic Tolkien scholar, but he is also one of the authorities on Lovecraft and things like Douglas A. Anderson. Mm-hmm. And I was telling him some of he's watched Dark Shadows, but I was telling some of the stories, and he's the one that pointed me to Seabury Quinn's Door Without a Key. He has one of the most incredible collections of kind of fantastic and fantasy and Lovecraft and everything. And so I really have to thank him for that. He got me in that direction. I'm still working with him on the Dream Curse. We're trying to figure out where Angelique's Dream Curse came from. But
yeah, that one, I don't know if they may have just created that one on their own. But Dark Shadows is, it's a tapestry of all these stories,
from every storyline in the world, exactly, for all the different storylines. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, but that's that Door Without a Key. I mean, it really is the throwing the wands and then visualizing, seeing the door that opens, going to the past. When I watched
the first time, I thought this isn't really what the I-Ching is for. I mean, it's like a fortune telling thing. And then when I read this, I said, aha, this is where they got it from. Yeah.
And I read your amazing article on Dark Shadows and world building, the world building of Dark Shadows, and how, there's sort of the transmedia world building of Dark Shadows and how it evolved, the show itself evolved as it went along. And I want to talk about that. But first, before we get into all of that, talk to me about your history with Dark Shadows. Now, you live in the UK. You've been living in the UK for the last 22 years, I think you said.
Yes.
So, but you're from New York originally, right?
I'm from New York City. Yep, I lived in New York City, and I was trying to think back. So I think my earliest memory of Dark Shadows, I was one of the kids who ran home from school, like the fantastic book that's just come out that I just finished, which is brilliant. And I can vaguely remember the 1840. I remember the Head of Judah Zachary very well. I remember that. And my cousins, Chris and Alicia, used to watch it with my brother, Tom, and I. And I remember we would all, and then I remember the last 6 months really well. And we used to go down to the studio and everything and stand in front of the studio and stuff. And then I watched it again. I watched the whole series again in reruns when they showed it on the New Jersey network. I was living in Secaucus, New Jersey at the time. And I remember it always came on after Uncle Floyd.
Yes.
It was a bit of a reverent children's show, shall we say.
Yes.
And I remember going to the Bottom Line in New York and actually seeing the Uncle Floyd show.
Wow. Cool.
And of course, I really got into it. I've always been interested in the Gothic and vampires and things. I think my father, somewhere there's a cassette tape of they asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I said, I want to be a graveyard taker so I can meet Barnabas Collins. And that's on a tape somewhere. But I really got into it when I was watching it on the New Jersey network, and I started going to the conventions. And so I went to the one at the sadly no longer there World Trade Center at the Vista. Yeah. And I remember meeting Joan Bennett, and I remember meeting Jonathan Frid, and I can still see his eyes. And I met Catherine Lee Scott and Laura Parker. And there was a wonderful question and answer where people started, asking Joan Bennett questions about what she was thinking of this scene and things like that. And you could tell she could clearly not remember.
Yes.
She would ask the fans, "What were you thinking?" And there was a wonderful skit that was done called "The Bed," which was all about Barnabas buying a bed with Julia Hoffman, and it was the funny. I'll never forget it.
Was that that must have been the Collinsport Players?
It was the Collinsport Players, yeah, absolutely. And it was a really good drag, Julia. It was great. It was done very well. And I remember I was staying with my dad at the time, and I decided to stay very late because they showed the two movies at the end of the night. It's amazing at these conferences. You go in these rooms and they would just run episodes, so you'd see the whole 1795 storyline and stuff like that. And I stayed very late because they showed the two movies, and then they showed the movie that Jonathan Frid was in, one of the films he did. And I got in trouble because I got back to Queens really, really late, and my father was not happy with me at all. But it was worth it. Yeah. And I bought a lot of the Marilyn Ross books and stuff like that. And yeah, I just kind of absorbed Dark Shadows. And then when I was working at my first job at New York City Opera, when I got out of college, I started buying the MPI videos. And I literally bought every one of those MPI videos.
Yeah, so did I. Yeah.
It was like boxes and boxes.
They took up a lot of space, those tapes. And the covers were great. And the extras were amazing that they filmed, all the interviews and everything. And so I watched that again. And then when I lived in Florida for a while, we watched them all on videotape. And then, of course, when they all came out on DVD, and I own them, they're all sitting in my living room right now. I'm looking at them. I own all of them. And then, of course, I just recently, like a couple of weeks ago, I read Patrick McRae's brilliant book, The Dark Shadows Day book. Yes, yeah.
And he suggested an interesting way to watch the series would be to start with 1795 and watch all the way through to when Barnabas gets chained in the coffin, and then watch Barnabas when he reappears in with Willie Loomis. Yeah,
that's really brilliant. I mean, that's a great idea to watch it in that order. How are you finding that?
So I just got to the episode where Angelique turns Jeremiah into a cat.
Joshua. Yeah, yes.
Joshua into a cat.
Yeah.
And I love. It's so funny. There's two things that jumped out at me right away. One is when Barnabas is choking, he constantly says to Angelique, "Can you help me?" Like he knows that she must have some kind of power or something. Well, that was interesting. And the other one is I love how the Countess is going, there's an evil woman in this house, but no one focuses on Angelique, who's out there picking herbs and, doing all this.
Right. I mean, at some point, I remember Trask questions Angelique, but it's later.
It really plays up to Trask, doesn't she?
Yes. Oh, it's a brilliant scene. I love that. Yeah, the two of them. But yeah, maybe. I mean, it's interesting with Barnabas because he seems very naive at first, but you also find out that during his travels that he's encountered mystical things like the secret number of the universe. And then, and then in 1897, he knew how to deal with a zombie. So he encountered that when he was in the West Indies. So he saw some things. So it's like, is he in denial in 1795? Did he just kind of dismiss those things that he saw at that point? Or
I've been doing that, and then I've also I'm almost done. I'm on book 31, I think it is, of the listening of the audiobooks, the brilliant audiobooks read by Catherine Lee Scott, who's fantastic.
The Ross novels, the audio versions.
They're so good. And what's amazing in hearing her perform them is you can tell that she's imbuing the characters with the memories of the voices of those actors.
Yes. Oh, definitely. Yeah.
So Elizabeth Collins Stoddard sounds like Joan Bennett, and all of that. And she does a great Barnabas. She does amazing voices. I mean, on this last one, she had all these accents. So I've got one more to do, which is Barnabas and the Vampire Beauty, which is the Elizabeth Bathory story, I think.
Yes.
Basically. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I listened to recently the Barnabas Collins versus the Warlock, and she did the great voice for that, for the professor in that, and then Asaph Clay. There should be a drinking game for how many times the name Asaph Clay is mentioned. Wow. But
I love the fact that Collinwood has a swamp.
Yes. Yeah. The swamp. Yes. Yeah, they're and I want to talk about that in terms of that world too, and all the different worlds of Dark Shadows, and how that supplements the core Dark Shadows. Now, I also wanted to ask you, when I had Stuart Manning on here, I talked to him about Dark Shadows in the UK and how when the Sci-Fi Channel started airing it there was, it was never as big as it was here, but it got a cult fan base there. But what's been your experience in terms of Dark Shadows in the UK?
I haven't met many people who know it. I mean, they mainly know it through that, not to be mentioned movie.
Right.
And ironically, I was at a party a couple of weeks ago and someone mentioned the Revival series to me. I think because Ben Cross just recently passed away. And they said, oh yeah, I remember watching him. They had the Revival series on ITV or something like that. But there aren't, which is one of the channels here. But most of the people I talk to here about Dark Shadows, they kind of look at me and smile and go, okay, yeah. All right. I've turned some people onto it here, actually. I say you've got to watch. It's amazing,
Good.
Yeah. I was with a friend and we were walking by Cadogan Square, which is Cadogan Square, which is right by the Royal Albert Hall, and I said, "Oh, this is where Barnabas said he lived."
Yes.
With what was his name? Bradford.
Niall Bradford.
Niles Bradford.
Yeah. Yes, his cousin Niall Bradford. Somebody needs to write a fanfic about Niall Bradford. I wonder if that exists. Somebody must have done it at some point. Stuart mentioned to me one thing I didn't know too was that either Dan Curtis or ABC tried to syndicate Dark Shadows to the BBC back right after it went off the air, like shortly after it went off the air here, and sometime in the early 70s, and the BBC passed on it at that time, which is a shame because that would have been a really cool. And I'm kind of surprised because when I look at early Doctor Who episodes, I mean, it's not a big leap from Dark Shadows to Doctor Who in terms of the way the production looked and stuff.
Yeah. No, I think it would be very popular over here, actually. I mean, I think it would would have been an interesting one. But not many people I know.
Well, now with the streaming too, streaming channels, it's more easily accessible if people want to find it.
Yeah. And recently there was this like couple of weeks where on Netflix, like that movie that shall not be mentioned, was very popular, and people kept going, "Is this the Dark Shadows you're talking about?" I'm like, no. The only good thing about that is that some of the original actors appear in a very one or two scenes, although we're not quite sure in what context they're appearing. But
right.
I said, no, that's not Dark Shadows, not Dark Shadows.
Yeah, it was so disappointing when you see them for just 2 seconds, they're in the doorway, and then
poor Jonathan Frid had to go all the way over to England, and he wasn't feeling, he wasn't in great shape, and I think they would have given him more screen time, basically.
Right. Even if it's just a cutaway to him just kind of standing there looking at the portrait or something like that. And I had heard there was supposed to be a scene with David Selby with some dialogue between him and Johnny Depp. And I don't know what happened to that. So I don't even know if that's true, but I had read that somewhere too. So that's a shame, but I'm glad we got to see them anyway, however briefly. So let's talk about your article, The Gothic World Building of Dark Shadows, which is a scholarly article as part of a collection of academic essays about exploring imaginary worlds. And Dark Shadows, when Mark B. Perry was on here, he quoted an article that was, I think it was on the Sydney Morning Herald about the show, a vampire show called Firebite. And I pulled the quote, and the quote was, "Firebite is more True Blood than Game of Thrones, obviously, but also benefits from past cable masterworks like Deadwood and Carnival, with their sharp and bold story points and natural ease with building an internal mythology." That last word, mythology, can be intimidating to both network executives and audiences, but it needn't be. The best genre shows of all time, Twin Peaks and Dark Shadows, were both built on mountains of the stuff. So Dark Shadows, it is rich in mythology. And part of that, the serialized format of Dark Shadows, as you mentioned in your article as well. Actually, I pulled that quote too. The narrative structure of the soap opera or daytime drama makes it an important candidate for in-depth world building. And it really is the case. So what is it about the mythology of Dark Shadows that appeals to you? How would you describe the mythology of Dark Shadows?
Yeah, it's a good one. I mean, the way I got the way this interest started for me is in 2012, a really interesting book came out by a guy named Mark J.P. Wolf, who edited this volume called Building Imaginary Worlds. And what his whole idea was, instead of looking at the narrative of a story, look at the world that the narrative is describing. And how is that world being created by using text, language, paratext, and my Tolkien interest. So my main Tolkien interest and kind of the work I did on the thesis. And then when I co-edited a Secret Vice Tolkien on Language Invention with Dr. Femi, was around this idea of how is language used in world building? How did we create peoples and cultures and things like that through the use of language? And I did, I've done some work, and I continue to do work on Tolkien. There's more coming, actually. But then I started looking at other texts. And the things that fascinates me too is, as you said, kind of that transmedia layering that happens when you have text, you have all kinds of text, you have written text, you have videos, you have what are called paratexts, like maps and writing and all that kind of stuff. And how is a world created? And what I, as I say in the article, I think one of the things Dark Shadows had is it was a daytime serial. It had the luxury of building long storylines and creating that sense of depth, basically, and so, I think Jonathan Frid described it as a dark brigadoon, It's kind of this world in itself. And it didn't really comment on the real world. It kind of lived in its own bubble. I mean, we knew there was a world out there, but no one ever watches television, or they might dance, down at the Blue Whale to the jukebox and things like that. But there's not a lot of the real world there. So it creates this world. You come into that world. It's almost what's called a portal framework. Like if you you think of something like Narnia, through Victoria Winters initially by saying, my name is Victoria Winters, and then it, that entry into it basically. And I think you're right. I think because it used so many Gothic and horror tropes, basically, it created its own mythology that had a depth of history, basically. This is not uncommon in other soaps. I mean, funny enough, I'm a massive fan. There's a soap over here called EastEnders, which has been on UK TV for many, many years. And the other day, someone mentioned a character that's been dead, many, many years, but it immediately had a depth of history to it because I remember that character. I lived that character's life. Mm-hmm. And so it creates a sense, what Tolkien called this inner consistency of reality, and that's what Dark Shadows did, so that you know the history of these characters, where they've been, and in the case of Dark Shadows, where they're going in some cases. Right. And so I think that's how it created a world. It created its own world, its own mythology, its own stories, and we can live in that world. And the reason we can discuss and debate what was Barnabas, was when Barnabas went to Angelique and said, please help me, in 1795 when he's being strangled. What's the story behind that? What happened that, we know we can have a sense of, because we have a sense of the world, basically. So there's a depth to it. And I think these days we see a lot of this happening through this idea of the narrative. If you look at the Marvel universe or any of them, basically. What I find fascinating about Dark Shadows, too, kind of like Star Trek, which I've just written a chapter about it for another book, is this idea of also the fan participation and the fan development of the world through things like fan fiction. And you have the world of Dark Shadows, and of course the conventions, which I got to go to a couple of. I meet people like, I met Joan Bennett, I met Jonathan Frid, Catherine. You get to meet these people and actually talk to them, which is amazing. So there's all that goes together, what Mark Wolf calls the Gestalt of the world, basically, and through that, you create a world that you can enter, that you can participate in, that you can discuss, that you can debate. Right. And that's the mark of a true world, that you can do all that, and that's what we can do in Dark Shadows, and new stories are being written, new TV series are being created and all that. It's all Dark Shadows, basically.
Right. Some fans do love that sort of playing in that world and trying to discuss it as if it's it's a story, it's a real world, it's a story that's been created. And having been an Englishman, I teach English professor, but I have been in that sort of discussing stories, discussing worlds, figuring out, character motivations, and looking at it from a formalist point of view, which is about reading the story based solely on the text itself, without considering external factors like what the writers forgot to include or something like that. And sometimes you'll talk to fans who do really get into that and like talking about it. And some fans will say, well, the writers forgot. And that's not, I think it's difficult to, when somebody is in that mindset, oh, the writers forgot, or that's not the right way to look at Dark Shadows, because it was, created very sort of spontaneously. And that is the real world explanation for a lot of it. But it's difficult to try to kind of explain what it means to look at that world and try to examine it within the context of the mythology of that world and how it functions,
Yeah, you have to operate. I find this with Tolkien too. And we won't go into all the current stuff that's going on around Tolkien.
I want to talk a little bit. I do want to talk a little about that.
Okay. But you almost have to live in two worlds. There's the primary world, which is looking into the secondary world from the primary world and saying, okay, clearly, when they wrote Barnabas, they had no idea what was going to happen with Angelique and Josette. And when he makes that, in that episode, when there's a storm, well, there's always a storm at Collinwood, but he tells Vicky and Carolyn the story of what happened that night on Widow's Hill. And clearly that doesn't match up exactly with what happens later in 1795. And you can say, well, that's because they hadn't created the Angelique. They hadn't created that storyline yet. Okay, that's fine from a primary world point of view. But from a secondary world point of view, you can analyze it and say, well, why isn't he telling the exact story? and look at it from a secondary world perspective. So I think that's the fun in a way.
Yes.
I mean, Roland Barthes said that, the death of the author and all that kind of stuff. And, in the Tolkien world, you often hear, well, Tolkien would never have, would never have done this, but every adaptation is a new adaptation, basically, and it brings in new insights and things like that. So, yeah, I think you put a kind of damper on things if you just think, well, no, we have to think of it this way, that Angelique cannot been created. Therefore, what Barnabas was saying was what was true at the time. No. Mm-hmm. In the secondary world, there's probably other reasons why he's not telling Carolyn and Victoria what really happened. It's the game to play in a way, But
it is, yeah. I describe it that way too. It is like a game or a puzzle trying to figure out, as you say, in the secondary world, why that was set, or when Barnabas tells Julia about his history with Josette, and it's completely different from what we actually saw. It's like, why did Barnabas tell her that? Was he lying? Why was he lying? Was he misremembering it somehow? Or did something scramble his memories? Like, we know Angelique was visiting the mausoleum from what we saw in 1840. Maybe Angelique was casting some spell to muddle his memory. I mean, it's interesting to kind of explore things like that.
The one that always gets me is really early on when Barnabas first comes to Collinwood when Willie takes him out of the carpet. He says, where were you when they put me?
Yes. Yeah.
And I always think, there needs to be some kind of exploration of why he says they put me, because clearly later on it's his father Joshua who chains him to the in the coffin, basically. Mm-hmm. What does he mean by they there?
Maybe Ben too. It's Joshua and Ben.
Yeah.
Maybe.
But in the primary role, you can say, well, because they still hadn't figured out the story of 1795. But But if you do that, then you're just then you're looking into it. And as Tolkien said, if anything goes world in your secondary world building, then you're in the primary world looking into this. He said this in an essay called On Fairy Stories, which he gave in the 1930s, and where he basically said, if you construct a good secondary world, then you're not in the primary world looking into the secondary world. You are in the secondary world. It's that kind of thing.
And so, you by secondary, like you quote Mark Wolf several times in your article with regard to Dark Shadows, and I pulled a quote from that too. The initial story world of Dark Shadows was very much like the example Wolf gives of overlaid worlds, in which there are fictional elements overlaid into a real world setting. However, as the texture of the story's narratives started to change, the world of Dark Shadows would move further along Wolf's spectrum of secondariness. Is this what you mean when you say secondary?
So the spectrum of secondariness, I think, is important, because you're right. It starts out very much more in the primary world, and of course, before we get the first supernatural, there's just the hint. There's the Jane Eyre and all of that. Mm-hmm. But then as Dan Curtis started going for it, we get, of course, the Ghost of Josette. We get the Phoenix, of course. And then, of course, we get Barnabas. And then from there, it goes more and more into that spectrum of secondary world. And, you're in time travel and parallel time and future time.
Yes. Yeah, sure.
All of that, basically. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I love that you keep drawing parallels to Tolkien here, because, of course, Tolkien was the master of world building. He created an entire mythology for his world, deep, rich mythology that is still beloved today and debated and discussed. What are your thoughts in terms of Tolkien's ongoing story? Because I want to get into the discussion about canon, and I want to look at canon too, because some people don't really like that word, and some people really, they live and die by canon. So what are your thoughts on, like, for example, Amazon is doing this Tolkien series, Lord of the Rings series. What are your thoughts on that? Do you accept new stories in the Lord of the Rings world, or is it cool but not part of Lord? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think one of the incredible accomplishments of Tolkien, and he spent most of his life working on what he would call his legendarium, which is the collected mythology. And there are various versions of it, starting with the book of Lost Tales that he wrote right after World War I, and he was working on it to practically the day he died. He was working on notes for Galadriel a couple of weeks before his death. So there's a vast canvas to play with there. And Tolkien himself said that, some of the stories he would complete in full and others he would only outline to be put together by other hands. He understood that. I think when we get to the Amazon series, they clearly have been, they've acquired the rights from certain parts of Tolkien's work, especially the appendices to Lord of the Rings and things like that. It's going to be set in the Second Age, which we do have some texts about, but they are clearly going to build upon that and develop new storylines and new characters and things like that. And for me, if that gets people interested in Tolkien, it's like I said, when the Peter Jackson films came out, which I thought were brilliant. If that gets people interested in reading Tolkien, I'm all for it, basically, as long as, as long as again, they are faithful to those storylines, if they adapt those storylines. Do you know what I mean? It's
sure.
And I think they will be. But I'm not a big fan of people getting all upset because they're tampering with Tolkien's work. I think there's such a vast canvas there. Some people will like it, some people won't. Okay, that's fine. But I don't think it should stop people from enjoying it. And it certainly shouldn't stop people from exploring Tolkien's works, basically.
Right.
And I think, this idea of Tolkien would be horrified if mentality is one that stops exploration. And I think these days we need as much exploration as possible. We need people to dig into these texts and bring new perspectives to it. So I'm all for it. I'm not bothered by it, quite frankly. And if it gets people to read more Tolkien, then job done. That's great.
Now, do you feel the same way about Dark Shadows and spin-off review with regard to Dark Shadows?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to what they're going to do with it. I mean, again, I think if it's done in a good, respectful way, it's like when I worked in opera. If an opera director came on board and said that they wanted to, I don't know, set Madame Butterfly on the moon. If the director had done their work and really came up with a reason why that would make sense, I would go for it. If they were just doing it to shock and set Madame Butterfly on the moon, then I had a problem with it.
Right.
So I think if the people who are going to revitalize Dark Shadows clearly are fans of the show, they clearly love it, it's going to be done from a labor of love, then I think it will be brilliant. Will it have new storylines? Yes. Will they all be great? Who knows? But I don't like getting mired in this idea that there's one text and that's it, and it can't be changed and stuff like that. And I, quite frankly, Tolkien wrote a lot of fan fiction. When you think about it, the Fall of Arthur, Sigurd and Gudrun, this was a lot of fan fiction. Tolkien was taking texts that he loved and studied and had a passion for, and he built upon them and he adapted them and he changed them, So why shouldn't we do the same with his work?
Absolutely. One thing I want to touch on too is with regard to Dark Shadows in terms of its storytelling. It does have that serialized structure. One thing you point out in your article, and I wish I had mentioned this when I did my characteristics of the Gothic episode, that Curtis subverted the traditional opening narration of past radio and television soap operas in which the voice of the sponsor would attempt to sell the soap or cleaning product to the listener before the episode began. In the case of Dark Shadows, an actor from the episode would deliver a voiceover narration as a teaser for the episode to follow. This would position the Dark Shadows world-building narrative as a tale being told, the television equivalent of the Gothic text trope of the entry into a journal or chronicle, as in the entries made by Jonathan Harker in his journal at the beginning of Bram Stoker's Dracula. You are right on point with that. It's and I think it's important if you're going to do Dark Shadows. I think you have to really lean into those Gothic horror, Gothic romance traits that are intrinsic to Dark Shadows. It is a serialized story, but I think if you push too far into more traditional soap territory, you start to lose what Dark Shadows became. You have to kind of keep, and Dark Shadows already had that framework, with the kind of the diary entries at the beginning. And I think you kind of have to keep that going, that style, that Gothic style for the show. If you lean too much into trying to do like a Dynasty or Dallas kind of a thing, like it starts to feel like that instead of like Dark Shadows. And Dan Curtis always said Dark Shadows was a very difficult show to do to get the right feel for it. And you have to look at it within the context of the Gothic to really nail it,
No, I agree completely. And certainly if you look at the pre-Barnabas, well, let's say pre-Phoenix episodes, it is trying to be that. And yet it still has a lot of those traditional soap tropes to it. And I think that's when Dan Curtis saw that he had to, radically change it if it was going to stay on the air, basically. And that, that scene when the ghost of Josette, came out of which was played by Catherine Lee Scott, apparently on a day off she had or something, that when that happens and you think, wow, okay, this is not your traditional soap opera. But even, I often think what it must have been like, because I've watched on YouTube, like some of those early soaps, with the announcer at the beginning saying, Lux Soaps presents Guiding Light,
Sure. Yeah.
You have watched that in the 60s and heard that opening narration, and my name is Victoria Winters. It must have just been so radical,
Yeah, it sets the mood. It creates this spooky feel, this eerie mood.
Especially at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when people are, back then are, what was soap operas for? That was for housewives doing the housework and all that kind of stuff, and then this comes on. I mean, it must. I was thinking about that the other night with Star Trek, because the new Star Trek Strange New Worlds is coming out, and I thought, what must have been like to watch the original Star Trek episode with that opening and everything back then? I mean, it's just
so different.
Yeah, exactly. It's just,
1966 was such an amazing year. And you pointed this out in your article too, that ABC was looking to do more supernatural stuff at that time. But just across the board, just the shows that came out in 1966, when you were talking about Running Home to Shadows, Jeff Thompson's article, like he lists all the shows that premiered that year. And it was, of course, we know Batman, Star Trek, and Dark Shadows, but also The Monkees, Green Hornet, Girl from U.N.C.L.E., Time
Hogan's
Tunnel.
Heroes. That was about a problematic show, but yes.
Right. Yeah. Colonel Klink is such an iconic character, but there's so much.
I'm looking in the Imperial War Museum right now. Yeah, that is an interesting one to reflect back.
Yes. But it really was quite a year for television, for sure, real groundbreaking across the board. But I want to look a little bit at canon. Okay. So you talk a lot about transmedia storytelling and sort of the paratextual storytelling. So we look at, I'm just going to pull another quote here. While the narrative texts of the 1,225 episodes established the core of the first phase of the Dark Shadows story world, the world Gestalt was also built through a series of paratextual elements over several types of media. One of the earliest of these was a series of 33 Dark Shadows novelizations written by William Edward Daniel Ross under the female pen name Marilyn Ross. As with the Ross novelizations, the writers of the comic series took the characters and story situations into new scenarios. So we're talking about the Gold Key comics here, thus expanding the story world of Dark Shadows through these imaginative texts. And then you go on and you talk about the Big Finish audios, 13-part original series Bloodlust, which introduced a new story arc to Collinwood. You talk about Lara Parker's novels from HarperCollins. Tor Books, HarperCollins, Angelique's Descent, Salem Branch, etc. We talk about the 2011 to 2013 Dynamite Comics, which published a line of Dark Shadows using continuity from the original series. And one other thing, I don't know if you mentioned this one, but the Sam Hall article in TV Guide also.
Yeah, what happened to everyone. Yep.
Yeah, so there's that as well. So these additional stories that help to add to the world, the greater world of Dark Shadows. I love that stuff too. I'm a huge fan of it. But there's something you mentioned too with regard to the Dark Shadows wiki page, where they tried to do a continuity that weaves in, or at least it tries to weave in the show with the Big Finish audios. And I have I raise my eyebrow at that sometimes, and especially when it's woven into individual character entries. Like if there's an entry for, I don't know, Joshua, and it references Big Finish stuff mixed in with the show stuff, I feel that stuff should be distinct or have a heading that says Joshua's history from the Big Finish. Because what makes, like if they contradict, for example, like the Lara Parker universe, the Sam Hall TV Guide article, and the Dynamite Comics universe, and the Big Finish universe, and potentially the Dark Shadows reincarnation universe, if that comes out, like those probably won't all mesh together. So what counts, in other words, as canon? And I know some people, when I had Stuart on here, he's like, I roll my eyes whenever I hear the word canon. And I get that, a lot of people do, but I'm looking at this from the secondary world perspective. Like what is canon and what isn't? And I was reading up on canon and fan lore, and I pulled this quote. I pulled a lot of quotes today. Paula M. Block, who was the CBS Consumer Products Senior Director of Product Development for Star Trek. And on the topic of Star Trek canon for IDW Publishing's focus on Star Trek issue, she says, canon in the sense that I use it is a very important tool. It only gets muddled when people try to incorporate licensed products into canon. And I know a lot of fans really like to do that. Sorry, guys, not trying to rain on your parade. There's a lot of bickering about it among fans, but in its purest sense, it's really pretty simple. Canon is Star Trek continuity as presented on TV and movie screens. Licensed products like books and comics aren't part of that continuity, so they aren't canon. And that's that. Part of my job in licensing is to keep track of TV and movie continuity so I can help direct licensees in their creation of licensed products. It gets a little tricky because it's constantly evolving, and over the years, Star Trek's various producers and scriptwriters haven't always kept track of or remembered or cared about what's come before. So I mean, I think if you get too caught up in what is canon and what isn't, it's too frustrating, and it's like that's a kind of a lost cause. I think there must be a middle ground. And I'm not saying that the licensed material isn't official. It is official, but it's canon versus non-canon. What is, what isn't. Like, I don't think of Return to Collinwood as canon, for example, even though it's an official licensed product with the actors. For me, the Dark Shadows 1966 to 1971, those 5 years of shows are canon. Even though the canon contradicts itself, we do the spackling thing and try to figure out how it works. Anything additional to that, it's kind of like pick and choose what works and what doesn't, kind of thing.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, what did David Tennant say in Doctor Who and timey-wimey,
Yes.
That kind of, I again, I think, going back to the idea of the game and things like that, I think it's interesting to look at those contradictions and see if you can figure out why that might be so in the secondary world. But again, life is too short. Right. But I've been thinking about this with Star Trek, actually, because with this new series coming out, of course, we are now in right before the original series started. So we're with Pike and Spock. And of course, Burnham's gone up to the future. So she doesn't exist. And that's why Spock never talked about her on the original series. Okay, that makes sense. But now you're going to have Captain Kirk, played by the Vampire Diaries guy, coming in season 2.
Oh, okay.
How's that going to work with the William Shatner continuity? Yeah. And then, Picard just goes crazy with time and, and Guinan and all that. So I think, but what I think is the thing is, it's not to see it as a challenge to figure out why that is so, I guess, but some things are probably never going to make sense.
Like, for example, like the Ross novels could never fit in with the TV show. Like it's really its own thing. And I just look at it as, we have parallel time in Dark Shadows, so it's a good way to explain all of those versions. But I think when you get into the sequel versions of Dark Shadows, like with the Lara Parker novels, like with the Big Finish audios, like with Return to Collinwood, like with the Dynamite comics, or with Reincarnation, if those things are sequel versions of Dark Shadows, which one is the official continuation of Dark Shadow. You know what I mean? Like, I assume the TV show, if it's a TV show or a movie, it supersedes everything else. I don't know. I'm not sure how that works.
I think the cleanest solution to this I've seen so far is when Disney took over Star Wars and just made everything that wasn't part of their lines legendary. Yeah. So if they're legends, they're not real, they're legends. And then there's canon, and I just, but of course, you can't, in your mind, you can't discount that. You can't think, okay, I read Heir to the Empire, so now that's legendary. That's not real. But actually now with Thrawn, it might be. No. I
was going to say they're like Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni are just throwing in, here's, everything. Cad Bane and Chrysanthemum and all these characters. I know. It's cool. It was cool to see that, It might be fun to see something like that. If they threw in I don't know, like a Ross character or a character from Big Finish that just shows up. It's like, they've now canonized some aspect of this.
Dr. Jekyll's son. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, right.
What I'm still looking for in the Gold Key comics, I would love to find a copy of it, is the one where Barnabas fights Vikings. I think it's called the Saga of Helgi something or other. Yeah. I just think that is amazing. Dark Shadow.
Definitely. I'm interviewing Sabrina Herman from Hermes Press this week. So we're going to be talking about those volumes they released of the comics are incredible. They're beautiful.
Yeah. And again, that was another way to really build, because you couldn't, half those plot lines you could never show on TV. They would never with him, basically.
Right. Barnabas with fighting the Viking wizard. Yeah.
You only had a living room for a couple of episodes, or a kitchen for a couple of episodes or something.
Those are fun though. Those things. They're just fun. The first time I saw a Gold Key comic, I've talked about my uncle Valdemar a lot on this show. Who introduced me to Dark Shadows, but I also have an Uncle Louis, who's actually is the same age as Uncle Valdemar, but Valdemar is my mother's brother and Louis is my dad's brother. Anyway, Uncle Louis also liked geeky stuff. He was more quiet about it. He was more of a Star Trek fan. I know he liked Kung Fu, the TV series. He had Kung Fu cards. Yes. Yeah. He had Kung Fu cards, but in his attic, I used to go to my grandmother's house and all Uncle Louis's old stuff was in the attic. So I used to go up there and look at his stuff and play with whatever he had up there. And he had comic books up there. Remember, he had Gold Key, Ripley's Believe It or Not. And he also had a Dark Shadows comic book, Creatures in Torment. Actually, you mentioned Creatures in Torment in your article. I was like, oh my God, I think it was issue 9. I want to say it was issue 9, like 1971, I think. And it's like Barnabas leaping on the cover. But that was my introduction to the Gold Key comics. And I remember it was like, there was a Dark Shadows comic book, because I knew what Dark Shadows was already because of Uncle Valdemar, but I didn't know Uncle Louis had a Dark Shadows comic book. I didn't even think Uncle Louis cared about Dark Shadows, but apparently he was interested enough to buy one of the Gold Key comics. So he wasn't even living there anymore. So I took the comic home and I would just read it and reread it. And I also remember trying to draw that cover, to copy the illustration, the painting on the cover. I tried to draw that, and then I colored it in of Barnabas from behind leaping down. I wish I still had that. I remember my 4th grade teacher mentioned Barnabas when I brought the comic in to show the class. But just a quick correction here after the fact. Not that it matters, but I'm going to throw this in anyway. I didn't bring the entire comic in. I remember my 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Fortin, from the very beginning of 4th grade, there was a kid in our class whose name was Jeff Collins, and she always used to call him Barnabas. And I remember she asked the class, does anybody know who Barnabas Collins is? And I raised my hand. I was the only one to raise their hand. And she was, I said, he's a vampire. And she was delighted that I knew this information. So the next day or a couple of days later, I ripped out that picture of Barnabas in the upper right-hand corner where he's baring his fangs, a little black and white picture. And I brought that in, and she loved that I brought that in and passed it around the class and had everybody look at the picture so they would know who Barnabas Collins was. And it was that very year as well that I finally got to watch Dark Shadows for the first time, because that was around the time that Uncle Valdemar got the grainy bootleg VHS tapes I've talked about a few times on here from syndication from a friend of his friend Mark got him, I don't know, like third or fourth generation VHS tapes. And this was about 82, I would say. So that was when I finally did get to see the legendary, since my earliest memories, hearing from Uncle Val about Dark Shadows and all the stories and looking at the bubblegum cards and the famous monsters and that Gold Key comic. Finally, I got to watch it. Yeah. So I have a fond association for Gold, a fond memory of Gold Key just from finding that comic and becoming obsessed with it. Because I hadn't seen Dark Shadows yet. I didn't get to see it until 1982. I just knew the legends of it and had seen it in Famous Monsters that Uncle Val gave me. But Uncle Louie had that Gold Key, so I could read that story over and over again.
No, and that's the thing. And then, like some of my favorites, like, with The Big Finish, I love the Tony and Cassandra.
Oh, those are fun. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And there's, take two, characters, from the show and just build this whole, again, world out of that, basically. Mm-hmm. And, two characters you didn't think would ever work together. And, and I thought Laura Parker and it was amazing in that. So yeah, I mean, I think, again, like Tolkien, there's a lot of canvas with Dark Shadows. There's lots of stories. And I don't think people should be upset if someone goes off in some, direction. And today, I think audiences today are so used to them. When you look at these massive universes like Marvel and DC and, all this stuff that they're building, it's just, they all become their own worlds, basically. And, you can have the Julia Hoffman adventures. I don't know. Something.
I would pay good money for the Julia Hoffman adventures if anybody decides to do that. That would be fun.
One actress I wish I had met in real life. I would love to have met Grayson Hall. She's just incredible. I was watching her as the Countess just last night, and those, oh my God, those eyebrows.
Oh, she was great. She is just so unique and theatrical. Like, she just exuded this confidence and this eccentricity. I mean, she was just wonderful. And I feel like, when I talk about the big three of Barnabas, Quentin, and Angelique, I should really, and also say Julia too, like she's sort of more the mad scientist archetype. I guess she's not mad, but obsessed initially.
Down in the basement with all of those weird,
right? Yes.
That go beep.
Yes, I love that. Oh, just so much fun.
That's incredible.
Yeah. But I think that would be an interesting, like if a new Dark Shadows series were to come out to sort of reference the Tony and Cassandra thing, that would be kind of a fun nod to that. If it's something like that, I remember reading the Sam Hall article when I first got into the fandom, and I was able to get, they reprinted it in several of the zines and stuff. So I was able to read it at that point. And I remember thinking at the time, like, that wouldn't have happened. So, but it's, he does say it's a possible world. Because I always figure Dan Curtis had final say and was a huge influence on the direction of the show. Sam Hall wrote that without Dan Curtis's involvement. So I feel like if Dan Curtis and Sam Hall and Gordon Russell wrote that together, it would have been a more complete picture of what we might have seen on Dark Shadows. Whereas, you know what I mean?
Well, I've always been fascinated to see, the actual creative process. And I don't know where the archive, I guess they're in the Dan Curtis archives, but it would be fascinating to see the scripts and the early drafts and things like that,
Right. Yeah.
And, like when it comes to things like, the I-Ching or the Leviathan storyline, who actually developed we know who the writers were, but was it, how did those stories, who was the original creator of that? And then how did it develop? And I don't know if there was time to do lots and lots of drafts of scripts, or did they just, write in a room and write it, basically. But it must have been at breakneck speed, because they were filming practically every day. So
sure. And then they threw the movie into it when they were doing.
And the movie. And where does the movie come in? And then
sure, we didn't even talk about that.
Oh yeah, I always wonder, like, so it's Night of Dark Shadows. So because they say Elizabeth is dead at the beginning, so that had to have taken place after House of Dark Shadows.
Right. It could. I've seen different theories about that. Some people feel it takes place after House of Dark Shadows and it's a sequel to House of Dark Shadows. Some people feel it's set in its own universe, because David is not mentioned at all. So did David die too, or is he away? Was he locked up at Wyncliffe? Like where what happened?
He didn't become a vampire like everyone else in House of Dark Shadows.
Right? Yeah. Liz and David, I think, are the only survivors.
Roger becomes a vampire, Professor Stokes.
Yes, yeah. And so again, I always go back to sort of the parallel time thing. It's like this is a
parallel time works. Yeah.
It's like this is a parallel version of what took place here. And then it's like at the end of the movie, did Willie miss Barnabas's heart? Maybe he just grazed him because Barnabas turns into a bat at the end and flies off because they're setting up potentially a sequel. So, but that, Frid didn't want to come back. So,
yeah.
So does that mean Barnabas went on to do more horrible things? Like what happened after this? So, did you get to see House of Dark Shadows in the theater?
I did. I sort of. So they played it actually when I was living in New York. I went to see it. And I remember it quite vividly, and everyone was like amazed at how bloody it was and how different it was too. Just because it was the original vampire story, wasn't it? It was in a way what Dan Curtis originally wanted Barnabas to be like. But no, I thought the star of it was Catherine Lee Scott. I mean, I thought she was amazing.
She pointed out that Leonard Maltin said she was in more scenes than Jonathan Frid in the movie, which is that's impressive. Yeah. Did you get to see Night of Dark Shadows in the theater too?
I saw Night of Dark Shadows later on. I saw it on, I think it must have been on VHS or something. And of course, I would love it. I mean, I know it was cut considerably. So I know that there's work trying to get the restored version. But I thought David Selby was brilliant, and Laura Parker was great in that. But it was just such a different kind of story and everything in a way.
It was strange. Yeah, it
wasn't Quentin. He was Charles, and all this kind of stuff. And
it was its own. Definitely its own. It was had a very distinct flavor in terms of being a Dark Shadows project. I'd love to see the Darren Gross's restored version of Night of Dark Shadows, and I hope to reach out to him and have him on here at some point, because I'd love to talk with him about that. And hopefully, when we talk about transmedia storytelling for Dark Shadows and building up the world of Dark Shadows surrounding the original show, things like that, if they're popular, if they get enough interest, could lead to things like the restored Night of Dark Shadows getting released, for example, and other things as well. I'd love to see more. I always talk about more. We need more Dark Shadows stuff, more Dark Shadows in the popular culture, more Dark Shadows ephemera items, things like that, because I find it disappointing when I go to an event or something like that. And I was just watching a video by a very popular YouTuber who does great videos, and she was talking about the New England vampire scare of the 19th century, 18th and 19th centuries. It was where New England is known for the witch trials, but we also had a vampire scare here, with Mercy Brown being the most prominent example of that. And she talked about fictional vampires and how Mercy Brown triggered this fascination with vampires and led to Stoker's Dracula. She talked about Carmilla, she talked about Dracula, and then she jumped from Dracula right to the Anne Rice vampires. And the way she described it is, that Anne Rice then spawned things like True Blood. And I said, you skipped the step there between Bram Stoker and Anne Rice. You have to have Dark Shadows. You have to have Barnabas. That is a pivotal moment in vampire history, where that transition takes place.
Well, it's like when Angel came out, everyone said, "Oh, Angel, the reluctant vampire." I'm like,
yes, yeah. You don't get to Angel without Barnabas. I mean, it's
exactly.
Yeah. So, and I wish more. That's the thing. I'd like to see more, at least more. I just think there's sometimes I feel there's a lack of awareness of Dark Shadows, and to the fact that it was such an important piece of genre history and had such a massive influence. Even the serialized storytelling in horror stories and things like that. That's, of course, we get that with the Gothic literature, but we also now, in terms of television, that serialized format is used for all of these types of shows. All of these types of horror, fantasy, sci-fi shows tend to use that serialized storytelling format.
Yeah, and what it shows too, and I always think it's an amazing show to like teach Gothic literature and things like that, because they use those Gothic stories, but they made it their own. It was Frankenstein. It was, Turn of the Screw. It was that, but it was within the Dark Shadows world.
Right.
That it was recognizable. Yes, that is Turn of the Screw. That is Peter Quint and blah blah blah. But it's within the Dark Shadows world, so it is Quentin and Beth and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But in a way, it's kind of like the way Tolkien, in many ways, has opened up the world of medieval studies, because people read Tolkien, they love Tolkien, they want to learn more about the languages, they want to learn more about, and of course they study Old English and Old Norse and Gothic and all of that. And that's, the Keys to Middle Earth is an actual book that's all about the fact that, that's an entryway into all those languages. And in the same way, I think with Dark Shadows could be an amazing entryway into studying Gothic literature.
Absolutely.
Got all those tropes there. And yet the writers did it in a way that made it unique. It wasn't just taking Frankenstein and putting it in Dark Shadows. It was incorporating the ideas of Frankenstein into the Dark Shadows story world,
Right. It was,
That's what I found fascinating. Yeah.
Same here. Just reimagining Frankenstein in that world, and Jekyll and Hyde and Dracula and all of these different, just a Turn of the Screw, the Picture of Dorian Gray, The Door Without a Key.
Yeah, exactly. All of that. Yeah. It's amazing. Of course, Lovecraft. I mean, the way they use the Dunwich Horror and all of that for the Leviathans, and it's amazing.
The Lottery, Shirley Jackson. I totally agree with you in terms of wishing I had access to that information. Like, how did they decide which stories to use, and how did that work in terms of the process of writing the show? Like, most of the people involved have point the finger at Dan Curtis and say Dan is the one. And we know Dan Curtis was a big fan of that stuff. He was a fan of the classic horror films and ghost stories and things like that. And he, I believe Sam Hall has said specifically that it was Dan Curtis that came up with the idea of using Lovecraft. He brought them Lovecraft, but there are all these stories about them having a Rolodex of summaries of different stories, and Dan Curtis hiring a speed reader to read all these, classic horror stories and boil them down. And I wish, we could know more about that aspect of it. Sadly, we've lost so many of those people. Like somebody like George DiCenzo, I bet, for example, would probably have had some insight into that, because he was the associate producer and he was Dan Curtis's right-hand man, kind of. Maybe Bob Costello, some of those people, and the writers, of course. Joe Caldwell is still with us, so
that's right.
I'd like to chat with him at some point. And
it was an interview I saw. I can't remember where it was, but it was with Dan Curtis's assistant. And she said apparently she went over to England and brought him back a book on Lovecraft.
Wow.
Yeah, and I'm trying to find the what book that was, but Lovecraft, it's usually just all his stories in a volume or something. So I wonder if that's how he read the Dunwich Horror and got the idea for good old Jeb Hawkes.
Right. Yeah.
Place this thing in the room that no one ever saw.
Right. The two Whately brothers merged into one.
Exactly.
Yes. What do you think the Leviathan monster looked like? Do you have any thoughts on? Do you think it was? What was? Have you ever tried to visualize what it might look like?
I just think of it as that weird breathing noise in the antique shop upstairs. That's.
I used to try to draw it. Like, what does it look like? Like, I kept hoping we'd see it, but our minds would not be able to handle what it was.
Exactly. It's unspeakable, unknowable. Exactly.
You're right. Are there any classic tales you would have enjoyed seeing incorporated into Dark Shadows? I've asked several people this, and I've gotten some really fascinating replies. Are there any, classic tales of terror or novels that you
I agree with
or archetypes?
I think a mummy would have been interesting.
Yeah, me too. Yep.
I think a mummy would have been, and I know one of the Marilyn Ross books deals with the mummy, but
that one is good. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one with the archaeologist is living in the building by Collinwood and everything.
Oh yeah, Dr. Andrew Collins, I think.
Andrew Collins.
Yes. Yeah, that would have been good. And the Gold Key mummy story is pretty good too, actually. As far as the Gold Key stories go, that one was a pretty good one too.
I also one of my favorite horror movies of all time is called Horror Hotel.
Oh, I love Horror Hotel with Christopher Lee. Yeah.
Yeah. Leave Whitewood now. And I always wanted Elizabeth Selwyn to come to Collinwood and like duke it out with Angelique.
Elizabeth Selwyn versus Angelique. Sign me up for that. That would be amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. The last scene of that movie with the cross, the shadow of the cross, and then all the witches are burning in the shadow. Oh, I love that.
It was great. That's a very moody film. Don't let the title dissuade you from watching it, folks. It's a Horror Hotel. You might get this idea. It's a B movie. It's actually very atmospheric and eerie.
And there's the mute. Lottie, the mute.
Yes, Lottie. Lottie. Yes.
So I think a duke out between Elizabeth Selwyn and Angelique would be interesting.
Oh, I would love that. That would be great. Now, I love how they kind of, if you look at Angelique's arc, I think it was Danny Horn in his Dark Shadows Everyday blog points out that, they take these characters that start out as villains, the monster characters, and pit them against worse monsters. So you start rooting for the person you were like when you have Angelique versus Laura, you start to kind of like, yeah, go Angelique.
Angelique. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yes. So it's interesting how they would do that and then build sympathy for this character that started out as a villain, and then you get all these anti-heroes leading the show.
Yeah, no, Angelique's in it. I've always been fascinated. I mean, I think Laura Parker is amazing at it, and the fact that I love that that it's been said a lot. When she went for the audition, and Jonathan Fritz said, you're the heavy and everything, and when she did that look into the camera with those eyes and everything. But it's funny, the episode I was watching last night, there's a certain vulnerability to her. Like she basically says, Ben, I need you, and then she's asking Ben's advice on what to do because Jeremiah is leaving.
Yeah.
So there is she played it with there was a hell hath no fury, but there was also a kind of vulnerability to it. And she developed that over the year. And, you do feel kind of sorry for her because let's face it, she was, Barnabas did say, did have a fling with her and everything, and then threw her away for Josette.
Yes. Yep.
I think they go through a very long journey and everything. But even last night when she was being, Angelique the Witch, there's a certain vulnerability to the way she plays it, which I think I think what ends up happening in 1840 is interesting too, with regard to Barnabas and Angelique. A lot of fans hate that, a lot of fans like that, but I think it almost makes sense, because I always saw them as two sides of the same coin. And I've quoted this before, with Magda saying, those two, they deserve each other. They deserve each other. It's kind of true, And so, what are your thoughts on 1840? Like, that's where you came into the show. What do you think of the 1840 storyline with Judah Zachary and I like the head. I like that in the Mask of Baal.
Yes.
Brilliant hair. I think James Storm caught my attention fairly early on, from what I remember. I thought it was good. I thought the whole. There must have been some real discussion in the writing room about the Miranda Duvall and all of that, and having Angelique, be Miranda Duvall and stuff like that. I thought that was but I thought the ending, it was heartbreaking, in that last moment. She gets, I'm not going to spoil it for people who haven't watched it, but I liked it. I thought it was interesting. James Storm was almost like another Quentin Collins, but then they kind of changed that, didn't they? They gave him more dimension and stuff. stuff. And I thought the Head of Judas Zachary was good. I thought the trial went on a bit too long.
I agree with that. I thought I liked 1840, especially the first half of 1840. I thought was really strong, but I do think it was interesting, the witch trial. But after a while, it did start to get just protracted witch trials, and it was just like witch trial in 1840. But Collinsport is this isolated little.
Barnabas is a lawyer, and he can defend Winston. It's like, when did he go to law school? When did that?
Right. The Last Resort, Vampire Lawyer. There's another spin-off where actually he was the curse. And that's the other thing too. It's like, how is Angelique able to? Spoilers. I put a spoiler tag at the beginning of every show now. So, but Angelique lifts the curse, but she was never able to do that before. So how?
All of a sudden she can lift the curse. I know.
It's like, you could have done that the whole time, because it's clear she didn't seem to be able to do that at one point. So how is she suddenly now? Maybe 1840 Angelique. I mean, this is Angelique after she has come back from the dead and is, because 1840 Angelique doesn't remember. Yeah, this is Angelique where she hasn't lived that life yet. Her time. Someday I want to do an episode that explores Angelique's timeline, because that's mind-boggling.
You need to get on some like really good time travel experts or something, and we can look at timelines and how they work, because there are times when you think, like, isn't there one episode where she says to Barnabas, like, you've already changed time or something?
Yes, in 1897. The way it works is like, you have, I guess, Miranda. A lot of fans have sort of accepted the idea that Angelique is a reincarnation of Miranda, because that's the only way that works, because we hear in 1795 that Countess Natalie Dupre remembers Angelique when she was a child and remembers her mother. So she must have been reincarnated from Miranda. And then 1795 happens. She dies. She comes back from the dead. Presumably Diabolos sends her back. And now she's even more powerful after she comes back from the dead. Then we get 1840 Angelique, the first run of 1840 without Barnabas. We know Angelique is visiting the mausoleum. Then we get Cassandra, 1968 Angelique. And then we get the return to 1796 Angelique, who was sent back as punishment to live in 1796, I assume to relive without being able to change things, because she acknowledges her experiences in the future. So she's already lived as Cassandra in 1968. So she's sent back to 1796, and she is destroyed again. She's burned by Ben and Barnabas. Then we get 1897 Angelique, because 1897 Angelique knows David and remembers.
Yeah, because you said I knew him as Cassandra. Yes. That's right.
Yeah. And so we got 1897. Then we get 1970. We get Leviathan era Angelique, who knows Quentin and remembers 1897. And then we go to 1840, and this is a previous version of Angelique. So it's a bit. So this version of Angelique in 1840 hasn't experienced the future yet.
And of course, she becomes Catherine Harridge, and then it gets really confusing.
Oh yes, the 1841 parallel time. What are your thoughts on that? Did you like 1841?
Great costumes. They must have gotten a really increase in costume budget, that's for sure. But I loved the lot. It actually made me read The Lottery, which is
it's great.
The basic core of the story is interesting. Yeah. But I immediately read that because it's that's all based on The Lottery, and I said, okay, I'll read that. I thought it was interesting, and I think Jonathan Frid was just so relieved to play another character.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting.
I mean, it was Wuthering Heights, and it worked. I thought the chemistry between the two of them was amazing.
I agree. Yeah, the Wuthering Heights meets The Lottery. The only thing I wish with 1841 parallel time, I wish we had a main timeline character to anchor that, like we did with 1970 parallel time. Like it would have been. Where was it? It was Jeff Thompson's article in Running Home to Shadows. He wished that Professor Stokes had stayed in 1840 and gone into 1841 parallel time to be our link to the present. That would have been interesting. That's because it just seems almost like it's off on its own in 1841 parallel time.
Was it Trask? Wasn't Trask?
Did Lamar Trask? Yeah, he did go. His body, he died in parallel time.
I would have loved to have been in the room when they came. What was the thinking behind that? Was it okay, let's try to, in these last couple of months, let's just create another whole world with, new characters, new stories, and not have it connect in any way, were they thinking, well, audience is starting to get bored of us, so let's try to create some, I don't know. It's interesting. It'd be interesting to see what the rationale was behind that. Actors on for, was it something where all the actors were basically saying, we want to do something different. We're sick of, being the same characters out of it.
Yeah.
Because they kept, Joan Bennett, Grayson Hall, they were all on it basically.
Right. And they brought back Louis Edmonds to be Brutus, and we had Nancy Barrett and John Carlin. They were all there. So, by December, they knew around Christmas time, I believe, they already knew that the show was going to be going off the air. And we know everybody was losing steam at that point. Dan Curtis was interested in making movies. The actors, the writers were getting burned out. Gordon Russell was carrying a lot of the load by the end. So I wonder if they were like, well, we're going to be off the air in a couple months anyway. So let's do something totally different. Maybe it was something like that, but it would have been nice to have a little more closure in the present with the present day characters, but maybe that's what's led to, I don't know, maybe that sort of ending was also played into the desire for more Dark Shadows. It's like maybe so. So my last question here, what is your favorite storyline of all time for Dark Shadows?
I would have to say 1795. It's funny rewatching it. They were all, just the uniqueness of the idea of, going back in time, using the same actors and actresses in different roles, having Vicky, react to that fact, the fact she sees Nathan Forbes and she thinks it's Joe, and also that's really interesting. And just the fact that really did, and you could tell I think you could tell the actors were really enjoying it. There's that real sense of energy and everything. I just think the stories are fantastic, and the introduction of Angelique, and it kind of did set the whole tone for the rest of the series. So I think 1795. I'm also a big fan of 1990. I love when they.
Oh yes, when they go to the future. Yeah.
With Mad Carolyn and all of that.
It's great. Yeah.
Which was considered the future then, and now of course is the past. But if I had to, I think, and rewatching it, it's just so good. 1795. So yeah. Yeah,
and it informed the rest of the series. They continue to reference the events of 1795 and the characters of 1795 up until 1840. They're still talking about, Victoria Winter's witch trial in 1795. Well, they changed it to 1797.
Oh yeah, they keep, that's why they're playing around with the dates. And then someone finds a bunch of clothes and they go, that was the old governess or something.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. All right, Andrew. Well, thank you so much for visiting with me today and taking the time to geek out and discuss Dark Shadows and explore this wonderful world. I
usually listen to this podcast on the beach in Brighton. I live in Brighton, UK, and I usually listen to this on the beach on Saturdays mornings. So I'm looking forward to. Although I can't stand my voice, but I guess I'll.
Oh, come on. You have a great voice. That's great. So you watch the waves crashing on the shore as
just like at the beginning of Dark Shadows.
Oh, perfect. Oh, that's fun. Well, thank you. I'm honored that you listened to it that way. And I appreciate you joining me today. Folks, be sure to, and where can folks, by the way, is this book available for the
It is. It's on Amazon and things like that, definitely. I also have a blog called Dr. Wotan's blog. It's one of my opera things. That's got some of it on there as well. It's not an inexpensive book. But parts of it are on my blog as well. So
okay,
they can email. I'm happy to give out my email if anyone wants to contact me, if that's okay to do.
Sure. If you would like to do that, feel free.
Yep. So it's AST Higgins, HIGGINS @me.com.
Great. And I will link to your blog as well, and to the Amazon listing for the book. It is a scholarly collection of essays, so it is a little pricey from what I remember looking at it, but it's well worth it. I mean, it looks like there are many interesting essays in the book, so I will link to that as well. And folks, please be sure to share this podcast with your friends. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. This is all about keeping dark shadows alive, or undead, as it were. So please do continue to tell your friends about it. And thank you very much for listening. And for as long as they lived, the dark shadows never truly vanished, for there will always be terror at Collinwood. Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.